Behind every picture-perfect love story lies the untold truth. And for Julia Trubkina and Brandon Gibbs, stars of Fiancé, that truth was darker than anyone could have imagined. Today, we reveal the shocking downfall of Brandon Gibbs and the heartbreaking choice Julia was forced to make. Brandon Gibbs became entangled in nearly $1 of debt through online gambling platforms. Brandon Gibbs, his wife, kept pressuring Julia Trubkina to pay off his secret $1 debt. Later on, as Brandon Gibbs failed to repay the debt, a lawsuit was filed against him, and he was subsequently arrested. According to the court's verdict, Brandon Gibbs has been sentenced to 1 year in prison. With this truth exposed, the situation turned even more tragic. Under constant mental pressure and facing numerous problems, Julia Trubkina eventually had no choice but to divorce Brandon Gibbs. Lastly, Julia Trubkina divorced his husband, Brandon Gibbs. Later, to start a new life, she decided to marry a man named Zach. Let's start from the beginning. Julia Trubkina entered the lives of Fiancé viewers as a vibrant, passionate, and determined woman from Russia. She was fiery, outspoken, and unafraid to stand her ground. When she met Brandon Gibbs, a soft-spoken man from Virginia, the two seemed like complete opposites. Yet, as often happens in reality TV romances, opposites attracted. Brandon, who grew up on his parents' farm, represented stability and tradition. Julia, on the other hand, embodied adventure and independence. Their relationship became one of the central arcs of the Fiancé franchise, filled with cultural clashes, parental interference, and the raw emotions of two people trying to build a future together in America. At first, fans were skeptical. Could Julia adapt to farm life? Could Brandon stand up to his controlling parents, Betty and Ron Gibbs? But episode after episode, viewers saw genuine love. Julia teased Brandon about his shyness, while Brandon adored Julia's fiery personality. They argued, reconciled, laughed, and dreamed together. When the cameras rolled, it all seemed picture perfect. They married, shared cute social media posts, and even discussed starting a family one day. But what no one knew, not the fans, not even Julia herself, was that Brandon was hiding a dangerous secret. A secret that would eventually destroy the foundation of their marriage. Because behind closed doors, Brandon had a growing obsession, online gambling at first glance. Brandon Gibbs looked like the last man you'd expect to spiral into gambling. He was quiet, polite, and grew up on a small farm in Dinwiddie County, Virginia, fixing fences, feeding animals, and helping his parents. On TV, fans saw a man overshadowed by Julia's fiery personality and his mother's control. But deep down, Brandon carried a restlessness no one saw one night. While Julia scrolled through Instagram, Brandon stumbled upon an ad, "Win big from home." Out of curiosity, he placed a $1 bet. When it turned into $1, his heart raced. For the first time, Brandon felt powerful, like he could provide more, maybe even move Julia and himself away from the farm. He didn't tell her, of course. Julia hated gambling. To him, it was just harmless fun. The fun quickie became an obsession. Online casinos offered flashing slot machines, live poker, and endless sports bets. Brandon stayed up late after Julia went to bed, chasing the thrill of his first win. Sometimes he earned hundreds in a night. Other times, he lost everything. But each loss only fueled his belief that one more bet could turn it all around. Soon, Brandon was gambling with more than savings. Credit cards maxed out. Payday loans stacked up. $1 in debt grew to $, then $, until it exploded into nearly $. Brandon lived in constant panic, hiding letters marked final notice and deleting angry emails from creditors. Julia noticed the change. Brandon was moody, distracted, and secretive. Their bank accounts showed strange withdrawals. When she confronted him, He brushed it off with excuses about farm expenses or bills. Julia wanted to believe him. She had given up everything to be with him, but the cracks in his lies grew wider. The truth came crashing down one afternoon when Julia opened the mailbox. Inside was a thick envelope stamped in red. Notice of default. "This is it," she whispered. "This is real. They're taking you to court." Brandon collapsed into a chair, his face buried in his hands. He had tried to deny it for so long, to pretend it wasn't happening, but now the reality was unavoidable. That night, Julia sat across from Brandon, her voice trembling but firm. "I don't know if I can do this anymore. I can't live like this, Brandon. I didn't come here to watch my life fall apart." Brandon's eyes filled with tears. "Julia, please don't leave me. I need you. I'll fix this, I promise. Just give me a chance." But Julia shook her head. "You had your chances. You had so many, and every time you chose to lie. I don't know if I can ever forgive you for this." The weight of Brandon's secret was now fully out in the open, and with it came a storm that Julia Trubkina could not have prepared for. The bright, outspoken woman who once laughed on day Fiancé found herself staring at a future clouded by shame, betrayal, and financial ruin. Julia lay awake night after night, staring at the ceiling in the darkness. Her mind refused to rest. Each time she closed her eyes, she saw the numbers dollar comma, a mountain of debt so high it felt impossible to climb. She thought about the sacrifices she had made, leaving her family in Russia, giving up her independence, adjusting to life in America. She had taken risks for love, believing in Brandon's promises of a stable, happy life. Now, all of that seemed like a cruel joke. Beside her, Brandon would toss and turn, whispering apologies that Julia no longer had the strength to answer. The silence between them grew louder than any argument they'd ever had. The creditors didn't stop. Day and night, the phone rang with unfamiliar numbers. Julia began to dread the sound of it. Sometimes she picked up only to hear harsh voices demanding repayment. Other times, Brandon would rush to answer, leaving the room to hide his humiliation. But there was no hiding anymore. Every letter that arrived, every notice taped to their door, was a reminder of how far they had fallen. Julia felt trapped, forced to face not only the financial consequences, but also the public shame. They were reality TV stars, after all. Fans online followed their every move. How long before someone found out? How long before the tabloids splashed their dirty secret across the headlines? Julia had always been strong-willed, but this situation tested her like never before. She tried at first to be supportive. She told herself that marriage meant standing by each other in hard times, but the resentment grew like a thorn in her chest. Each time she looked at Brandon, she didn't see the man she married. She saw the lies. She saw the weakness that had brought them here. "You didn't just ruin your life, Brandon," she snapped one evening. "You ruined mine. Do you even care what this has done to me?" Brandon, his face pale and sunken from stress, could only whisper, "I'm sorry, Julia. I never wanted this for us." But his apologies, repeated endlessly, began to feel empty. As the lawsuit moved forward, Julia was dragged deeper into the nightmare. Court dates were set. Lawyers became involved. Every document, every form, every meeting was a reminder of the chaos Brandon had created. Julia sat beside Brandon in the lawyer's office, her arms crossed, her jaw tight. She listened as they discussed repayment plans, settlements, and the possibility of prison time. At one point, the lawyer looked directly at Julia. "If the debt cannot be repaid, Brandon faces serious legal consequences. Mrs. Gibbs, this will affect you too. Your joint assets, your accounts, your future." Julia's heart sank. "My future?" she thought bitterly. What future? The emotional pressure became unbearable. Julia found herself snapping at friends, isolating from family, and even avoiding social media. She couldn't stand the thought of pretending everything was fine when her world was falling apart. At home, arguments with Brandon became routine. She demanded answers he couldn't give. She demanded solutions he didn't have. Do something, she screamed one night, slamming her fist on the table. Find a way out of this. Don't just sit there waiting for everything to collapse. But Brandon had no answers. His once quiet, easygoing nature had now turned into paralyzing despair. He barely spoke, he barely ate, and Julia began to wonder if she was fighting a battle she could never win. One evening, after another exhausting day of phone calls and paperwork, Julia sat alone on the couch. Tears streamed down her face as she whispered to herself, "This isn't what I wanted. This isn't the life I dreamed of." For the first time, she allowed herself to consider the unthinkable. Maybe I can't stay. Maybe this marriage is already over. She looked at Brandon, slumped in a chair across the room, his eyes hollow, his spirit broken. And in that moment, Julia realized something painful. She no longer saw him as her partner. She saw him as her burden. The day of the court hearing arrived like a stone Julia could not escape. For weeks, she had dreaded this moment, the culmination of Brandon's secret life unraveling in front of strangers in a courtroom. The man who once promised her stability and love was now facing the harsh reality of his actions and dragging her down with him. The courthouse was cold and intimidating. Julia walked beside Brandon, her steps heavy, her face pale with exhaustion. She wore a plain black dress, not for style, but for survival, blending into the background, avoiding attention. Brandon looked even worse, his shoulders slumped, his eyes shadowed by sleepless nights, his suit hanging awkwardly on his thin frame. As they entered, Julia could feel eyes on them. Whispers followed. Some recognized them from Fiancé. Others simply saw another man in trouble with his wife by his side. Either way, Julia wanted to disappear. Inside, the legal process unfolded with chilling formality. Lawyers spoke in clipped tones, presenting documents, outlining debts, and emphasizing Brandon's failure to meet obligations. Each figure mentioned dollar. Here, dollar, there. Was another dagger in Julia's heart. The prosecution painted Brandon as reckless and irresponsible. They presented records of late payments, screenshots of gambling platforms, and transaction histories showing thousands of dollars lost in a matter of minutes. Your Honor, the prosecutor said firmly, this is not simply a case of financial mismanagement. This is a pattern of addictive behavior, of dishonesty, and of total disregard for the responsibilities of a husband and a citizen. Julia lowered her gaze, humiliated. Every word felt like a public shaming, not just of Brandon, but of herself for being tied to him. Brandon's lawyer tried to soften the picture. He spoke of a man overwhelmed by pressure, caught in the seductive trap of online gambling. He emphasized Brandon's previously keen record, his history of hard work on his family's farm, and his deep regret for his actions. Brandon himself stood and addressed the court, his voice shaking. I made mistakes. I thought I could fix them, but I only made things worse. I never meant to hurt Julia or anyone. I take full responsibility. Julia, watching him, felt torn. Part of her pitied the broken man in front of her, but another part, a stronger part, felt cold and numb. She had heard these apologies too many times before. After hours of arguments and evidence, the judge finally delivered the decision. Mr. Gibbs, the court finds that you have repeatedly failed to meet your financial obligations. Your gambling debts, your dishonesty, and your inability to resolve these matters have left no alternative. You are hereby sentenced to 1 year in prison. The words echoed through the courtroom. Brandon's face went pale, his mouth slightly open, as though he couldn't breathe. Julia's hands trembled, but she didn't reach for him. Not this time. The gavel struck, and just like that, their world collapsed. Brandon was escorted away in handcuffs. Julia watched in stunned silence as her husband, the man she once danced with, laughed with, dreamed with, was led up like a criminal. His eyes searched for hers, desperate, pleading. But Julia couldn't bring herself to look back. She stood alone in the courtroom, surrounded by strangers, her heart heavy with anger and grief. The days that followed were some of the darkest Julia had ever known. News of Brandon's sentencing spread quickly online. Fans of Day fans, they speculated, blogs reported, and social media filled with comments. Some pitied her, others mocked her. Julia tried to ignore it, but the humiliation cut deep. She felt like the world was laughing at her pain. She wanted to scream at them, to tell them they didn't know the full story. But deep down, she knew she had lost control of her own narrative. She visited Brandon, once in prison during those early weeks. He looked smaller behind the glass, his hands clutching the phone, his eyes desperate. "Julia, please," he begged. "Don't give up on me. I'll change. I'll be better. Just wait for me." Julia stared at him, her heart torn in two. But when she spoke, her words were flat, lifeless. "I don't know if I can, Brandon. I don't know if I want to." And with that, she walked away, leaving him to face the consequences of his choices alone. When the prison doors closed behind Brandon Gibbs, Julia Trubkina's life changed forever. For the first time since arriving in America, she felt completely alone. The cameras of Day Fiancé were gone. The excitement of their whirlwind romance had faded, and what remained was a hollow silence that filled every corner of her life. The house they once shared felt different now. Brandon's absence was everywhere. The empty chair at the kitchen table, the silence in the evenings where his nervous laugh once filled the air. Julia would walk past his belongings, the shirts he left behind, the pictures of their wedding tucked into dusty frames, and feel a wave of anger, sadness, and nostalgia all at once. At night, she sometimes caught herself reaching across the bed, instinctively, only to find cold sheets where Brandon used to lie. But instead of comfort, the thought of him only reminded her of betrayal. Brandon tried to stay connected from prison. He called Julia whenever he could. The colored calls came at odd hours, the robotic voice always announcing before his voice broke through. "This is a call from an inmate at Julia." He would say, his voice heavy with regret. "I'm sorry. I think about you every day. Please don't give up on me. I'll change when I get out. I'll be better." At first, Julia answered. She listened. Sometimes she cried. Other times she sat in silence while Brandon poured out apologies and promises. But over time, she began to dread the calls. His words felt like chains dragging her back into a life she no longer wanted. She started letting the phone ring, ignoring his desperate attempts to cling to her. With Brandon gone, Julia faced the world alone. Friends she thought she could count on slowly drifted away, some not knowing what to say, others judging her for staying as long as she had. Even fans of the show turned against her online. Some comments mocked her. She should have known better marrying Brandon. Others pitied her. Poor Julia. She gave up everything for him, but none of them knew the real pain. Julia felt trapped between humiliation and freedom, free from Brandon's lies, but burdened with the shadow of his mistakes. Julia tried to rebuild her life. She took on more work, tried to distract herself with hobbies, and even considered moving away from the small town that reminded her of everything she lost. But it wasn't easy. Financially, she was still tied to Brandon's mess. Emotionally, she carried scars that wouldn't fade. Each time she tried to focus on herself, the past pulled her back. Even mundane things became heavy. Grocery shopping alone, paying bills by herself, walking past couples holding hands. All of it reminded her of what she thought she had and how quickly it had crumbled. Evening. Julia sat on the couch, staring at the wall, the silence pressing in on her. She thought about the years she had spent with Brandon, the sacrifices, the love, the fights, the dreams. And for the first time, she admitted to herself, I don't love him anymore. The realization was like a weight lifted and a knife to the heart. At the same time, she felt relief, but also grief for the woman she used to be, the one who believed in fairy tales and happy endings. Brandon, meanwhile, wrote to her constantly, letters filled with apologies, confessions, and desperate pleas. I know I failed you, one letter read. I know I ruined everything, but please don't give up on me. I need you when I get out. You're all I have left. Julia read them, sometimes crying, sometimes laughing bitterly. She kept them in a drawer, unable to throw them away, but unwilling to let them soften her heart. Each letter only confirmed what she already knew. Brandon was a chapter of her life that had ended. The year that Brandon spent behind bars felt like an eternity for Julia. Each passing day was a test of her strength, her patience, and her ability to survive in a country that often felt more foreign than ever. But as the months went by, Julia's heart hardened. The love she once had for Brandon was replaced by resentment, exhaustion, and the heavy truth she could no longer ignore. She needed to let go. Julia's breaking point came one afternoon in early spring. She had just returned home from work when the phone rang. Another collect call from Brandon against her better judgment. She answered. Julia. Brandon's voice crackled through the line, filled with urgency. I've been thinking about us, about when I get out. We can start fresh, you and me. I promise. No more lies, no more gambling. We can move forward. Just give me one more chance. Julia clenched the phone, her chest tight. For months, she had listened to these promises over and over, but nothing changed. His words felt like a broken record, rehearsed and empty. No, Brandon, she finally said, her voice shaking but firm. There are no more chances. You destroyed everything. I can't do this anymore. There was silence on the other end, then a desperate plea. Julia, please don't say that. Don't give up on me. You're all I have. But Julia had already made her decision. For the first time, she hung up on him. That night, Julia sat at the kitchen table with a blank divorce petition in front of her. The papers looked simple, almost too simple for what they represented. The end of her marriage, the cutting of ties to the man she once believed was her summit. She hesitated, her pen hovering above the page. Memories flooded her mind. Their first kiss, their wedding vows, the playful moments fans had adored on day Fiancé. But then came the darker memories, the lies, the debts, the humiliation, the endless pain. With trembling hands, she began to write her name, and with each stroke of the pen, Julia felt the weight of her decision.